Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the phenomenon of unstable coalitions. Now, an unstable coalition is a possible variation on a coordination problem or a collective action problem. It's not, strictly speaking, a strategic game, but one distinctive feature of the unstable coalition is that there are many players and more than two options, right? So in the coordination problem or the collective action problem, you have many players and two options to select from. Here, the unstable coalition only arises if you have three or more options, and even then, the options have to be, the preferences of the players have to be ordered in a very particular way. Alright, to consider it in the abstract, let's imagine that three friends are trying to go to dinner. Let's imagine, in fact, you and two of your friends, let's call them Taylor and Whitney, want to go out to dinner to discuss a new project that you're going to be working on together. The most important thing is that you go to dinner together so you can discuss your project. However, each of you has different preferences about where to eat. So far, it looks a lot like the coordination problem, but there's three people. Now, your favorite choice is pizza. And if you can't get pizza, your second choice is burgers. And if you can't get pizza or burgers, your third choice, which you can live with just fine, is Chinese. Now, Taylor has different preferences. Taylor's favorite choice is burgers. And if Taylor can't get burgers, then Taylor wants to eat Chinese. And if not Chinese, then pizza is just fine. Whitney's favorite choice is going to be Chinese. But if Whitney can't get Chinese, then pizza is good, and if not pizza, then burgers are just fine. So we've got three friends, each have preferences that differ about which option to select, and they order their preferences in a different sort of way. So if we want to use shorthand, right, to summarize the preferences, your preferences are pizza over burgers over Chinese, so P better than C, and P better than B, and B is better than C, and therefore P is also better than C. That's transitive property, right? So if P is better than B and B is better than C, then P has to be better than C. Taylor prefers burgers to Chinese to pizza, so B is over C over P, and B is also preferred to P by the transitive properties. And then Whitney prefers Chinese to pizza to burgers, so C to P to B, and of course C is therefore also better than B, right? So there's a greater than sign. It's just like in mathematics, right? So greater than, so if 5 is greater than 4 and 4 is greater than 3, then 5 has to be greater than 3 by the transitive properties, right? Logical properties of mathematics. Okay, so the first thing you can note is that there's no clear winner. If we pit all of them together, say, what do you want to eat? You say pizza, Taylor says burgers, Whitney says Chinese, and because there's one vote to each, there's really no clear, obvious winner. But you guys still want to eat together, and you guys still need to eat. That's important. So where should you go? Well, there's an alternate option here, because we have the preferences, the fully specified preferences of all the players in this game. Maybe it's possible that if we run all the preferences against one another, one of the candidates will emerge as capable of beating all the others. And this sort of proposal that's capable of beating all the others head-to-head is called a Condorcet winner, named after the French mathematician and revolutionary, I believe, from the 18th century, the Marquis de Condorcet. So that's a Condorcet winner. A Condorcet winner is a proposal that can beat any other proposal pairwise. That is to say, running them up one against the other, not all against all at the same time. Okay, so let's search for the Condorcet winner. Let's run our first potential pair matching, pizza versus burgers. If pizza's running against burgers, then of course you're going to pick pizza because it's your favorite. Taylor's going to pick burgers because pizza is Taylor's least favorite. Anything is better than pizza for Taylor. And Whitney is going to pick pizza because pizza is Whitney's second favorite, and burgers are the least favorite, so P is better than B for Whitney. You can see that over on the left. So pizza wins 2-1, right? So pizza beats burgers. All right, so maybe pizza is our Condorcet winner. If pizza beats Chinese, we have a Condorcet winner. So let's run it again. You clearly prefer pizza to Chinese. Pizza is your favorite option. Taylor prefers Chinese to pizza. However, pizza is still Taylor's least best option, and Chinese is still better than pizza. And when we look to Whitney for the tiebreaker, well, Whitney's favorite is Chinese. So of course Whitney's going to pick Chinese, and so Chinese beats pizza, so pizza is not a Condorcet winner, but maybe Chinese is. In order to figure out whether Chinese is our Condorcet winner, of course we have to look at see whether Chinese beats burgers, right? So does Chinese beat burgers? Well, let's look. You prefer burgers to Chinese, B over C. Burgers is your second favorite. Chinese is your least favorite. So burgers is going to beat Chinese for you. Taylor, his favorite is burgers. So Taylor is definitely going to pick burgers over Chinese, which means Chinese has already lost. Only Whitney prefers Chinese to burgers. Whitney casts a vote for Chinese against burgers, but she is already, or he or she has already lost 2-1. So there isn't a majority in this situation, and because of the way the preferences are ordered, there isn't a Condorcet winner either. So where does that leave us? Well, it makes it very difficult to pick a place to eat. What should we do? Should we just flip a coin? And quite frankly, in this sort of situation, maybe flipping the coin is the best that you can do. You do need to eat together. Remember, in this particular case, you prefer any matching outcome to any non-matching outcome. So in that sense, it's going to be a variation of the coordination problem. You could also imagine the situation, however, as a collective action problem where actually there's some cases where you'd rather, you prefer a non-matching outcome to some, at least some, maybe not all, the matching outcomes. One thing you could do from here is try to figure out how intense each preference is on the part of the members of each group. So it might be the case that some of these options are intensely preferred or intensely disliked. And in that case, if we add up the intensities of the preferences, we might still get a winner, a Condorcet winner, or even a majority winner. So I want to imagine that, for instance, you're allergic to soy sauce. And if you're allergic to soy sauce, then maybe everyone can agree to steer clear of Chinese. And then it's just pizza versus burgers, and we know that pizza wins against burgers 2-1. So if we can eliminate one of the options, the choice becomes much clearer. But let's think about that situation for a minute. If someone really wanted to get their way, they would have a strong incentive to claim that they were allergic to the food they did not like in order to try to manipulate it off of the table and therefore ensure that their favorite option ended up winning. And of course, if everybody does that, then the coordination fails entirely. If everybody says, my least favorite preference should be off the table, then coordination fails and you still haven't solved the problem. So you have to be careful about measuring intensities. Right, so the problem in politics when considering the intensity of the preferences of the actors is that everyone has very good reasons to pretend like they care a lot even when they don't. Because if intensity of preference matters, and I don't say that I care a lot, my opponents, if they say that they care a lot, will end up carrying the day. They will always win even when they don't care a lot. So what happens is when you consider intensity of preferences, the incentive is to always pretend like you care a lot. Everyone has a strong incentive to raise the stakes because if you don't raise the stakes, if you don't claim that you care a lot, someone else might. So in theory, considering the intensity of how much each person cares is a good idea, but in practice, we don't have any reliable way to measure how much each person cares. We don't have the ability yet to reach inside people's brains and find out the truth about how much they care and about what they prefer. There might be a big difference in what people say they prefer and what they actually prefer. And so intensity, while in theory a solution, politically, practically, doesn't work very well. Now, the reason the situation is called an unstable coalition, another word for it you might see sometimes is a cycling majority, but it means the same thing. So one reason it's an unstable coalition is that as soon as one proposal wins, pizza, burgers, or Chinese, there is another proposal that is capable of luring one of the friends to defect from the current winner, the current majority coalition, towards another proposal. So you and Whitney are the winning coalition in pizza versus burgers, but when Taylor, who is outvoted, proposes Chinese versus pizza, right? If Taylor suddenly proposes Chinese, then Whitney is going to leave your pizza coalition to join the Chinese coalition because Chinese is her favorite, and Taylor has just proposed lured Whitney away from your winning coalition. But now that you're on the outside, and you propose burgers, which is Taylor's favorite food, then you suddenly can have a winning burger coalition against Chinese, and therefore improve your own situation by luring Taylor away from the Chinese coalition. And of course, once burger is the winner, then Whitney can lure you away from the burger coalition by proposing pizza again, because we know pizza beats burgers, and so on and so forth. So you can see that every time that a proposal wins, another proposal can be proposed that lures away a member of the coalition to a different proposal, and on and on and on again. Effectively, what you have here is that individuals with perfectly rational transitive preferences aggregate themselves into a group with irrational preferences. The group is irrational because the group prefers A to B, B to C, and somehow prefers C to A. That's why it's cycling. Normally, if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you prefer A to C. But in this case, it looks like C beats A, or if we want to use the initials that we've been talking about the whole time, right? P is better than B, B is better than C, but somehow C is better than P, right? Chinese is better than pizza, even though pizza beats burgers and burgers beats Chinese. Again, this sort of situation is unstable. It's, in some sense, if an individual had those sorts of preferences, they would be irrational, but this is a group preference, and there is no stable group preference. And that has puzzled people and makes people a little bit worried, because you could imagine, in a situation that's slightly more important than what to have for dinner. So, for example, what kind of healthcare policy we should have. And if there's 3 healthcare policy proposals on the table, and our congressmen have different preferences of the ordering of these proposals, we could go round and round and round forever, and then we could never have a healthcare policy, even though everybody would much rather have a healthcare policy. They prefer any matching outcome to any non-matching outcome. Everybody would like something to be done about the cost of healthcare, but because they disagree about which proposal and about the ordering of which proposal of the proposals on the table, you can imagine that nothing gets done, and of course that makes everybody worse off than they might be. So this sort of situation is going to be very frustrating if it comes up in politics, particularly in legislatures, and it's going to be time-consuming to work out. Note that deciding what to have for dinner, I don't know how it works in your family, but deciding what to have for dinner is often very time-consuming. But individuals want to, as much as possible, avoid having these unstable coalition situations. And states, of course, want to avoid these things when dealing with other states. You could imagine some sort of international agreement on global warming, and everybody wants to do something about global warming, but they disagree about exactly what to do, and the preferences are ordered in such a way that every proposal gets beaten by some other proposal, and so nothing gets done about global warming, and that might be bad. You can imagine that congressmen want to avoid these things dealing with other congressmen. We just talked about it in the case of policy proposals, and political parties want to avoid them when dealing with other political parties, particularly in multi-party systems. We'll see that in the United States, because we have a two-party system, we don't have this problem, but if you go to Scandinavian countries, or if you go to Austria, you go to Switzerland, you have to come up with a way to keep parties in the coalition and prevent other parties from luring them out of the winning coalition with a better proposal, a proposal that they prefer. Okay, so we said we could flip a coin, or we could try to measure the intensity of each individual's preferences. Note that that's not what happens in the U.S. political system. In the U.S. political system, what happens is that people try to facilitate, or try to change the rules in order to facilitate bargaining between individuals, right? So, for instance, you can imagine in the dinner situation, you and Taylor could try to strike a deal saying that you'll always vote together in all proposals. Sometimes Taylor gets his or her proposal, sometimes you get your proposal, but the idea is that you impose some sort of penalty on non-cooperating, and you have some sort of bargain, right? Say, we agree to always vote together, and if we don't vote together, then some penalty happens to one or both of the individuals. And basically, this is kind of the creation of a political party. If you think about political parties are groups of people who share at least some interests, and political parties have ways of disciplining their members who aren't cooperating, right? They say, if you're not voting together with the party, we can withhold all kinds of goodies from you: campaign funds, political support, important committee seats, and so on and so forth. Right? In a political context, of course, creating political parties is fine. Although there's times we probably don't want a permanent alliance, but perhaps a more temporary one, right? You don't want to form a political party and always vote together, but you would like to be able to form some bargains nonetheless of a more temporary and fleeting nature. In Congress, you have something called log rolling. Log rolling is simply agreeing with another congressman to support their proposal if they support yours. So it's just a bilateral treaty, right? It's just an agreement to say, okay, you care a lot about healthcare and I care a lot about the environment. I will vote on your healthcare bill with you and you vote on my environment bill with me. And of course, because congressmen are constantly called upon to vote on bills, many of which they don't care very much about, they're absolutely willing to in some sense, sell or bargain away their vote on one piece of legislation if they can get their way on stuff that their constituents really care about. You can imagine, of course, in our dinner situation, if you say to Whitney, I'll agree to burgers this time around if you support me on pizza next time around, you're in a group of friends, it's very plausible, rather than forming some sort of political alliance among a group of friends, it's quite plausible to say, well, we'll go out to dinner again sometime. Right, so, this time it's your turn to go to get burgers, and next time it'll be my turn to get pizza, and we all win, right? Because it's an ongoing relationship. It's going on into the future. There will be other times to go out to get food together, and so, that makes it a very sort of easy sort of situation to fix. And among friends, this works because there's A, trust, and B, an ongoing relationship. But among politicians, we have to note that there's going to be less trust, typically, particularly if they're not in the same party, and there's no guarantee your partners are going to be around after the next election. They might get defeated. And so, the ongoing nature of the relationship is sometimes in question. So what that means is that, there's less incentive to cooperate because, of course, if they're not going to be around, then there's no opportunity to reciprocate the favor, and that means you don't want to grant the favor in the first place. In principle, it's going to be advantageous for politicians to develop ongoing relationships, and this is where, in some sense, this sort of logic runs against some of the conventional wisdom about politics, where you want frequent elections to keep people accountable, and you want, ideally, you want perhaps term limits to stop people from becoming career politicians and becoming insiders and kind of, all of that good stuff. But at the same time, there's a good argument for having professional politicians and having people who are over and over reelected to the same position because they are much better partners for cooperation. They're much more reliable, they're likely to be around, and so they are much more likely to be able to strike deals in situations where you have coordination problems or even collective action problems. They are reliable trading partners, so to speak. They're reliable bargainers, and term limits and frequent elections actually tend to make politicians less reliable and less able to reach bargains and less likely to make deals with one another. Because in order to solve problems that everybody recognizes are there, because people just aren't going to make bargains if they don't know when or if the favor is likely to come back. Okay, other things that you could do, and this is important, other things that you could do to solve the problem is by agreeing in advance to rules that limit the number of options on the table and the number of rounds of voting. Right? So there's a different set of solutions. Let's talk about each in turn. If you want to limit the number of options, of course, when you only have two options on the table, we said the problem of unstable coalitions just doesn't arise. The coordination problem will still be there, right? But the unstable coalition does not arise, and so the cycling of majorities, if you have two options on the table, one of them has to get a majority. So how do you do that? How do you limit the options to two? Well, we'll see that in politics, electoral rules favor the creation of two major parties in the United States. The fact that people have to run into that parties have to run in a series of districts against one another means that in order to win a district, you have to get 50% of the vote or so, which encourages the creation of parties that can roughly get 50% of the vote. If your party can't get 50% of the vote, it can never win a district, and so it can't ever be relevant. you will see that other sets of electoral rules actually have different sorts of incentives, and you can have more than one party because you don't have to win any districts in order to be relevant at the national level. Okay, so you limit the options to 2 parties by creating electoral rules that tend to foster a 2-party system. Now, among friends, that's hard to do, but of course you could try to manipulate the location you're in to favor only 2 real food options. So it might be the case that you prefer pizza to burgers to Chinese, but if there's no pizza joint in your neighborhood, but there's burgers and Chinese right around the corner, that limits our realistic food options to 2. And so one way to get around some of these cycling coalitions is to be in an area where the options are limited. Again, counterintuitive, because ideally you'd think more options is better. But it's not always clear that when we have to coordinate that more options is better. More options is more negotiation and more opportunities for coalition raiding, which is another word for unstable coalitions, is that coalitions get raided. Okay, another thing you could try to limit is the rounds of voting. In legislatures around the world, including the U.S. Congress, there are typically rules limiting the number of times an amendment can be proposed, or limiting the number of amendments that can be proposed to a given piece of legislation. So, for example, if pizza has already been proposed and lost, then you can't bring up pizza again in this particular round of negotiations, right? Or in a legislative session, if a particular amendment has been defeated, you can't propose it again. And what this does is this limits the number of rounds of voting, and when you do this, when you limit the rounds of voting, then the order in which you consider proposals is going to be key to deciding which ones win, because of course you know that in your pizza versus burger situation, if you start with pizza versus burgers, pizza's not going to win. Right? Pizza eventually gets defeated because you can't repropose pizza. If you start with burgers, burgers is not going to win. If you start with Chinese, Chinese is not going to win. So which vote you run first conditions who ends up winning when you limit the rounds of voting, right? The first winner is never the final winner when there's an unstable coalition. So, if you can control the order in which proposals are considered in this sort of situation, that effectively means that you can decide who wins, assuming that you have good information about the preferences of all the voters. The person who controls which proposals are voted on and in what order is called an agenda setter. Anyone who has the power to decide which proposals make it to a vote and in what order those proposals will be voted on has a really substantial say over the outcome when there is no clear majority winner. Actually, even sometimes when there is a clear majority winner, you can manipulate that majority to lose if you have control over what order proposals are voted in. Okay. Now this is important, and I think for a lot of people it's a source of worry about American government. They worry about agenda setting, right? One worry is a separate worry. It's a worry about democracy, where you have perfectly rational individuals whose preferences aggregate into irrational preferences. That's a worry about democracy, about aggregating the will of the people. If there's no will of the people, right, there's no will of the people in some cases. Nothing has a majority. The people don't have a coherent preference. So that's a worry about democracy. But there's a more specific worry about agenda setting, right? The public has no majority preference, but wants to coordinate on some proposal, and the proposed solution ends up empowering just some individuals to manipulate the options or rules so as to create a majority behind a proposal. So in other words, the majority is created, or manufactured is sometimes the word used. You have a manufactured majority. It's not really a true majority because there's no true majority preference, but you manufacture a majority strategically. And that doesn't sound very democratic. But let's bear one thing in mind. The public's preference when there are coordination problems is to actually coordinate. Remember, any matching outcome, any policy is better than no policy if this is a coordination problem. And so the fact that no single proposal can gain a majority is not especially devastating as long as it really is a coordination problem, as long as it's true that something is better than nothing, right? After all, eating with your friends is always better than eating alone, at least the way we set up the situation. So if it's a coordination problem, the fact that there's no stable majority and that some people are agenda setting may not be a huge problem. It's a problem if your preference ends up losing, but remember that you still prefer something to nothing, and there's just doesn't seem to be any rational reason to, from the group's perspective, prefer pizza or burgers or Chinese. There's no Condorcet winner, and there's no clear majority. However, agenda setting also occurs in cases where there's no agreement that something is better than nothing, that any matching outcome is better than any non-matching outcome. Because remember, there's always the option of not doing anything, or in the case of our example, eating alone, right? We assume that the friends want to dine together more than they care which option they settle on. But in the real world, that's not always the case, and that's going to be what we talk about in week 4 of the online course, that is the collective action problem. In those cases, some people want to coordinate and others don't, and we can no longer assume that just about any agreement is better than no agreement. Now when you do agenda setting, now when someone's forcing a minority proposal through, it seems harder to justify because you have some substantial portion of the population that doesn't agree that any proposal is better than no proposal. Right? And furthermore, there seems to be a bias in politics for action over inaction. Right? Elected officials are not rewarded for doing nothing. They're often rewarded for passing legislation. They're often rewarded for the things that they do, not the things that they don't do. I don't know that that's rational, but that's the reality of it. Of course, not doing something is a decision, and sometimes it's a very good decision. There's often very many reasons to not do anything. But it's rarely something that politicians can ever take credit for. And so there's always this incentive to try and do things. And agenda setting enables action over inaction, right? And it enables action even in cases where no clear majority favors action, or any particular action anyway. So politicians like rules that facilitate taking action and taking credit, but the public may not like these rules and may not always benefit from such rules. Remember, sometimes the best reason to not act is because you're still waiting for more information to come in. Like you don't know enough to act well, and you might screw things up, so the best thing would be to wait. In other cases, it's just that any action actually is worse than the disease you're trying to prevent, right? The cure is worse than the disease, so to speak. Right? So there's cases where you put an expensive bureaucracy in place to solve a pretty minor problem. Maybe that's just not worth anybody's time. So, let's conclude. Sometimes where there's a recognized need for common action, there's no single proposal can command a majority or provide a Condorcet winner. In this case, we often have something called an unstable coalition, or a cycling majority, or coalition rating. All names for basically the same thing. Rules that facilitate decision-making in the face of unstable coalitions will help solve these coordination problems when those people want to coordinate. But if it's not a coordination problem, then some serious worries emerge about these sorts of rules and about the democratic legitimacy of that kind of agenda setting.